The Vietnam experience has touched all of us and has influenced veteran authors and poets. And we are blessed in chapter 109 to have two published authors of our chapter. Mark Fleming wrote At the Speed of Foot in 2012. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you.
And most recently, we really want to thank Larry Kirshner, who has just published a collection of his poems with the title Gravelines. Welcome, Larry.
Thank you.
I'm very interested, and I'm sure our viewing audience would be interested, how did this Vietnam experience influence you as writers and poets? And so I'm going to bounce that question off of both of you, but I also want us to have a conversation while our cameras eavesdrop on our talk. So how did the Vietnam experience influence you as a writer?
Well, for me, in simple terms, it gave me something to write about that I can't forget. It keeps rolling around in my brain, and I keep processing it and thinking about it, and over the years come to a different perspective. And I've written some poetry. My book about the Appalachian Trail includes it, so it's always there. I mean, and even if I'm not writing about Vietnam, somehow it influences the way I think about other things.
And this is your first book that you've authored?
First book of prose. I had a book of photography out earlier, but that really didn't touch any of this.
And I know that that book has a number of references towards your experience and how that has influenced you on hiking the Appalachian Trail.
Right.
And I'm going to ask the same question for you, Larry. How did your Vietnam experience influence you as a poet?
Well, the Vietnam experience influenced my whole life, and I've written poetry since I was a child, but really didn't start taking poetry seriously until I had returned from Vietnam. I met some poets in Alaska and started trying to deal with the feelings, the impressions, just the whole experience of Vietnam. And somehow poetry, for me, seemed like an appropriate way to deal with it. It's a way of trying to encapsulate strong, intense scenes or emotions in a small number of words.
Larry, you have a book called Gravelines, and I'd be very interested how you chose the title Gravelines.
I actually went through about 6 or 8 different titles, and finally, most of the poems in this book are fairly intense. I described it as being in-your-face kind of poetry, and for the person reading it, I want them to understand this is a grave thing that we're talking about. And there's a double entendre of grave and headstones and that.
Being serious as
Right.
well as headstones.
And lines, in the military, you're always got to be in line, lines of poetry. So it was kind of a double entendre. And I ran across something that Yeats wrote in a letter to a friend of his. He said, "I am still of the opinion that only 2 topics can be of the least interest to a serious and studious mind, sex and the dead." And the next book that I'm planning will take up the other topic.
Okay. You did warn our viewing audience that this was an in-your-face collection of poetry, and I didn't really catch that until I read the first one, and it was called Answering a Question. And the first line said, "The first man I killed was small and hidden in the tall grass." Well, that caught my attention, and I realized this is a serious poem. Would you read that one to our audience?
I will. This poem came out of something that we did in this chapter, 4 or 5 years ago. There were a number of us wanted to do something to help with counter-recruitment. So I came up with the idea of interviewing a dozen veterans and asking them the question, what would you like someone who's considering going into the military to know? And we did a 3-minute interview with 12 people, 1 conscientious objector and 11 veterans. And then we got some local bands to put some music in. We put that CD out. And this poem came out of part of what I had to say to answer that question. That's where the title comes. Answering a question. The first man I killed was small and hidden in the tall grass. Being a killer forever changes you. Even if you learn to be kind and considerate and civilized, that part of you is always there, hiding down inside, awaiting a chance. A normal person does not want to kill and will avoid it at all cost. The military won't allow you to remain normal. It doesn't matter if you think that you are smart enough not to get caught up in their lies. They will change you. Don't be sucked into the biggest myth and lie that killing and dying for your country is somehow heroic. Really be all that you can be. This poem actually, when I first got there, I was an armored personnel carrier driver. And one of the first battles that I was in, we were driving through some tall grass and there was a man hiding from us in the grass. And as I rolled over him, his head got caught in the track and caused the track to come off the vehicle. And the driver's job is to put the track back on the vehicle. And it's, there's, 100 shoes, each one weighs about 25 pounds. So you have to take the bolts out, lay the track out, jimmy your vehicle, bring the track back in, put tension on. And this is in the midst of a firefight. They're shooting at you while you're doing this. And this man's head had caught in the track, so his body parts were all the way across the track. So that's a pretty intense memory, the smell and the sound and the whole tension. So that's part of where that poem came from.
Thank you for sharing that. Mark, you had a different experience than what Larry did, but it still has influenced you greatly in all of the things that you are involved in peace and social justice. And one of those things, as I understand, it led you to take a long walk.
That's true.
Do you want to tell us about that? Because that is the title of your book, At the Speed of Foot, which is about the only speed I move in nowadays.
And it's the speed most people don't move in, which is what gave me the idea for the title. And the long walk started, I came back from Vietnam and I didn't have anything happen to me like what Larry did. I was in the field, things were going on around me, but it never touched me in that way. So nothing happened, right? But something wasn't right. And I came back to Virginia and found the mountains and started walking. And of course, I'd learned to backpack in Vietnam. I could carry a heavy pack and I could hump mountains in a long time. So I started walking, and all the years I saw the Appalachian Trail. Like, well, it goes this way to Georgia and that way to Maine. And wow, I could never do that. Well, long story short is, yeah, I did. I mean, I finally decided I wanted to do it. But by this time, that was 30 years later, and Vietnam was just there. It was something I'd sort of dealt with, but nothing happened, right? So I went walking, and the experience was pretty profound. That it was with me. It had always been with me on the trail, but they were always short trips. Walking in the woods, yeah, it's kind of like Vietnam, but it's over in a weekend, you're back to the job, back to normal life. Well, now it's day after day after day after day.
And when you say after day, we're talking maybe 2 or 3 months of walking?
Yeah. I mean, the whole trip was 180 days. This really took place in that first half as I walked into Central Virginia. That's where this had all happened, and it really helped me come to terms with it. I mean, I can't change what I did. I mean, I went to a war I believe was wrong. I can't change that. But what I can do is take that experience and relate it to others. Tell people, like Larry does with his poems, that this is what happens, and this is how it changes. And the ironic thing is, I went to Vietnam thinking, I'm just going to get past this. I'm going to get it out of my life and get on with it. And I realized you don't get past it. That was a big.
Well, in page 71, you said thoughts of and about Vietnam followed me up the trail.
Yes. They were there. You know, it's like I called it my daily thought parade. Everything, you know, I would think about Maggie, I would think about friends back in Phoenix, I'd think about this, but Vietnam was always there. And there were some days, I don't know if I can find it right off, but some days just felt like I was back in Vietnam. The sense that I had, that I'd be walking along, I'd be walking along and that there could be a booby trap, or I could set one. There was always something in the wood line you needed to check.
Yet this is somewhere along Appalachia,
This is back
and your mind would go right back to,
I was back in the world, and somehow my mind was back in Vietnam. I had an experience of falling in with poets, and they could express themselves in such short, direct bursts. And that's how Vietnam comes across much better. I mean, there are people that have written fantastic novels, nonfiction pieces, and all of which add to it. But if you really want that sense of how it was and in the immediacy, the poetry really works.
What you just said reminded me of this poem. It says, driving, I remember to note sights which would be good for an ambush. Walking, I watched the ground for dirt which may have been recently disturbed in the laying of mines. Over 40 years later, I still expect the bullet to hit that spot just below my left scapula that always itches like a target. Over 40 years later, I remember when we were boy warriors thrown together far from home. Gun smoke, thick as fog, hot brass litter, the lamb-like smell of napalm, burnt indigenous personnel, piles of bodies, slowly moving limbs in rigor, green thick Vietnamese jungle vines, sticky red clay mud in monsoon season. If he wasn't part of that piece of me that couldn't come home, maybe I could remember my friend's face 40 years later. It's that same feeling. It's always there.
You can't forget.
Yeah.
Larry, I was moved when I read on page 69, "Whoa there, partner."
Oh.
And that was an interesting one. Why don't you read that for our audience?
Yeah, I'm not even sure where this one came from. It just sort of happened one day. Ho there, partner. Democracy doesn't mean choose your own government. An American broom of culture and rightness sweeps history clean. Didn't you know people aren't even a sandstorm in this desert landscape where our free market vision will be built? We religiously sing the new American spiritual, a simple melody of redemptive violence. The song we sang with patriotic pride at My Lai, Nagasaki, and Dresden will replace your grandfather's wailing tune. Your illusions will be cured by the chemotherapy of depleted uranium, leftover cluster bombs, and Yankee enthusiasm. You will sleep at midnight. I will steer the boat down the Euphrates. It's the American sureness that we know we're so exceptional that we know what's best for all of these people, especially the brown and the black people, that whatever it is that we think should happen, it's obviously meant by God, and that's the way it should be. So, yeah, when I was in Iraq, this was between the two wars, and seeing all of the kids there that had diseases as a result of the depleted uranium. I talked to one pediatrician who, we were there in August, and between January and August, she had seen so many kids, it was like 60 kids with major fetal anomalies, that a normal pediatrician wouldn't even see that many in a whole career, and yet we're doing nothing about the whole depleted uranium. We left over 3,000 tons of depleted uranium in Vietnam, in Iraq, and that has a half-life in the billions of years. I wrote this one poem. We stopped at a hospital one day and met this 14-year-old boy named Kamal. He was nothing but skin and bones, and we just visited him there in the hospital, and I breathe in Kamal 3 days from death in a Baghdad hospital. I breathe out a happy, laughing 14-year-old boy. I breathe in the grasping Imperium. I breathe out America as she should be. I breathe in my life. I breathe out. It's, the destruction to the children of the world that we're causing is the thing that moves me most. We killed 500,000 children under the age of 5 through the 13 years of sanctions against Iraq. And Dick Cheney had the gall to expect that our troops would go in there and they would greet us with candy and flowers after having killed 500,000 of their children. To me, it seems like American foreign policy is, we will kill your children until you do what we say.
Until you like us.
Or even you like us, yeah.
Well, keep in mind, Dick Cheney didn't have the experience you and I had about going to war.
Yeah.
He still sees it as
Exactly.
one of those great ideas.
John Wayne movies, yeah.
Larry and Mark, one of the things I do with veterans is emotional freedom techniques. And you've shared, both of you, some very hard things. I want us to pause right now that you can join me and our viewing audience. So if you want to put your book down, one of the things that we can do is to help us to de-stress and to deal with some of these memories and unwanted memories is to do the following. So I want you just to join me and tap on the meridian point. And this would be just a quiet one. We don't need to say words, but our minds are filled, our subconscious is filled with some of the thoughts, the poems, the images that we have, and it's good that we just take that time to de-stress. And if you want to tap on the other meridian points, there's a point on the eyebrow, just on both sides, we can tap on that. And on the side of the eye, and underneath the eye, and on the nose, underneath the nose here, and under the chin here. And this will make a sound that our mics will hear, but it's just on the chest here. And then under the arm, and on the top of the head. And I want each of us to take a deep breath and to let it out slowly. Many times when we're dealing with veterans who have the type of experiences that each of you have experienced, we have a subconscious memory of that event. And I know you have as a poet, and you have very carefully brought out words that I was reading with my eyes, but I was tapping with my hand, Larry, just so that you would know, And as you were sharing poems, I was mentally tapping, because I know that those are stressors, but it gets the truth out. And we, as Veterans for Peace, want to have a show that deals with the cost of war. We also want to see healing brought to victims of war, both those that were part of the occupied countries that we were part of, and also ourselves and others. And so I'm glad that we have that opportunity to share with our viewing audience.